Well, good evening, First Baptist Church of Jasper, Georgia. It's Wednesday night, and we are in the middle of the faith of our colonies. Tonight is talking about Rhode Island and the Baptist. Usually we mention a few colonies, but since we're talking about Rhode Island, it's very unique to us because it's a lot of where we find Baptists show up for the first time. So within the Puritan communities in the Northeast, the Puritans were very they really were restricted on how they lived. There were a lot of laws, and a lot of people began to struggle with these laws set down from the church. And so a lot of people, because of the intolerance of these Puritan communities, began to look for other places to live. So to understand Rhode Island, you have to understand a couple of people who began to get the ball rolling for this. And we'll find that Rhode Island has something unique to us because it is the founding of where Baptists began to show up for the first time in the United States. And we find the First Baptist Church. So to understand this church, we have to understand a couple of people that really began to push this concept of religious freedom, religious tolerance. The two people we're going to talk about tonight is Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Anne Hutchinson was a lady within a Puritan community, and in Massachusetts, she got expelled. She got expelled because she began to have visions and tell people about those visions. And so when she got expelled, her and 18 other friends left. They left and they headed down to Portsmouth, right off the coast of Rhode Island. It's now a part of Rhode Island, but it was an island. And they bought land from the Native Americans. They bought land from the Native Americans, and they found this place based on religious freedom, that you could come and practice whatever faith tradition that you wanted to. There was no hierarchy saying from where the church or the state wasn't combined like it kind of was in the Northeast. So you began to see people like Quakers and Baptists and other smaller traditions that often faced a lot of harassment within other communities. The other one was Roger Williams. Roger Williams was one that was a little bit more prominent, did a little bit more. We hear about more in the history books, I guess you would say. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631. In Boston, they asked him to pastor a church there, and he refused. He felt like the church and the community were too restrictive toward the people. And he was also really bothered by how the colonists interacted with the natives, how they occupied and took a lot of the land from the Native Americans. And this made him very unpopular within the colonists in Boston. So he eventually moved to Plymouth, and then eventually moved to Salem, where he found a pastorate he took a pastorate. And in that taking that church, he tried to get the church to break away from the Puritan church, to break away from the Massachusetts authorities. And folks didn't like it, or the authorities didn't like it, and he got expelled. So he left with a group of people to Providence, and they bought this land from the natives, and they founded on religious freedom, just like Anne Hutchinson. And so this new colony began to be set up that their citizenship wasn't based on their faith practice, that they were a citizen of that colony, but they weren't tied to a certain tradition that they had to practice. 1644, Roger Williams goes across the ocean to England to ask for legal recognition to form the colony of Rhode Island in Providence Plantation. So they began to govern as a democracy. And then here, this is where Williams kind of created the first Baptist church, a congregational-led church where there was no other hierarchy over it like there was in the Puritan colonies, dictating how the church had to function. But he didn't stay long. He didn't stay long because just like in Boston, he began to talk about more progressive ideas. These other ideas that he began to talk about in this church that he was pastoring there, that he had a deep love and respect for the Indians, the Native Americans. And he began, as he got to know them, he began to feel like that their faith tradition was acceptable to God as the people who were practicing their faith within the Baptist church. And that the natives did not have to become Christian. This began to anger some of the Baptists and some of the other traditions within the area, and they ran him out. So he's got this theme of constantly getting pushed out. So this concept of Baptist that he introduced came from, it wasn't just a uniquely American American tradition, that this Baptist tradition began to originate over in Europe. And it even goes back further to trace it back to what we would say the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were a smaller group of people that emerged from the Protestant Reformation. And these folks believed that one needed to be baptized as they became an adult, as they began to confess their faith publicly. Where in other traditions during the Protestant Reformation and beyond, you were baptized in infants, and even traditions now still baptized infants. And so the Anabaptists had this model, and it began to influence a group that were more congregational led, and this group began to emerge within the Netherlands called Baptist. And they were a group of people that were also influenced by Jacob Arminian. Jacob Arminian was a man that created this I guess you would say, this thought process called Arminianism. Some people call it doctrine. And Arminianism was this belief that Jesus was for everyone. That Jesus' message, the faith of Jesus, this Christian faith was for all. So Baptists began to hold on to that idea. And then, within the Baptist churches, there began to emerge this other view of Calvinism. And Calvinism was this belief that the message of Jesus, this faith, was only for a select group of people. And so within the Baptist church, you had these particular Baptists that were more Calvinist, and then the general Baptists who were more Arminianist. And so as they began to emerge within the Netherlands, the more Calvinistic Baptists found their way toward England. And the Arminians began to move toward Rhode Island. And this is where, Roger Williams and all them kind of come together. But in Rhode Island still, you had a mixture of people who were general and particular Baptist. And you have this theme of general, particular Baptist, this title, for hundreds of years that emerged while the United States was colonies, or even after they became, a country. So this Baptist movement spread throughout the colonies, but it often faced a lot of persecution in colonial life. And so congregations were often expelled, for trying to form in Massachusetts, but they eventually found their place in Rhode Island, where a place where they knew that they were going to be accepted, they were going to be embraced. And so as religious tolerance grew within other colonies, they began to spread and to become more prominent in other places. So, and then you find things like the first and second great awakenings, where Baptists began to move out even further within the United States, before the United States became a country, and then afterwards. So that kind of wraps it up. Next week is the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and we'll complete our discussions about the faith of our colonies. Hope you found this helpful, meaningful. Hope this has inspired some more research to just begin to read a little bit more about this stuff. This is fascinating to me, and it kind of gives us an idea of where we came from. It's so important to know where we came from. So thanks for joining me. Hope you have a good night, and I will see you next week on Wednesday night.